G'day legends, I hope you are having a fantastic day and so far you are having a brilliant weekend. Now today you may have to bear with me. Currently where I live we're in a bit of a thunderstorm at the moment, so if you hear a lot of rain or lightning's coming through the microphone, I apologise. Legends, today as always we do have a lot to go over, but we're going to be looking more at maps, footage, doctrine and situations as well. We've actually stuck away a little bit from doctrine in the past couple of weeks and months, and we shouldn't. So we're going to look at withdrawal from both sides, from if you are trying to pull out of an area or you are trying to force an enemy not to withdraw. You're trying to get them to go from a withdrawal to a hasty retreat to rout, and the ability then to leverage your advancements on that and then concentrate forces to destroy the enemy. So we're going to look at that. And of course, that is going to be looking at Pokrovsk. And that's going to be most of the video today. Maps, situation, overview, Pokrovsk, looking at that GUR Special Forces helicopter mission. Perilous. Looks like it was very costly into that sector yesterday. We'll look at the maps in other areas as well. So a lot to go over. Where we're going to start is actually with this. So as you know, at the beginning of every month, of course, we have just started November. Within the first week, we give you some numbers to show momentum on the battlefield. Now, as you know, I always talk about attritional war, that this is not a war of maneuver. Now, kilometre squares made, lost is, of course, very important, especially because there has been some level of unfreezing of talks, not negotiations, not really talks about ceasefires, but there has been some level of at least communications unfrozen by the US. So, of course, that is important in that aspect. But again, it is not the priority. The priority in a war like this is to destroy your enemy, and therefore, as a byproduct of that attrition, you gain or lose then political leverage. Of course, one of those being kilometre squares. Let's have a look at this. But of course, it's important to see momentum and years prior. Can give us an idea of the standing militaries in the field too. We'll get more details over the next coming days from AMK, Suryak and others. War Mapper, he's just fallen off the face of the earth. But the Deep State is saying October, the enemy, the Russians, occupied 267 kilometre squares of Ukrainian territory. Numbers are identical to those in September. And you can see mid-year and then down into where we're seeing basically these envelopment fights at the moment, therefore not getting that large exploitation of area. But did you hear that? My God. Anyway, you can see it's still going. Anyway, you can see this down in here that this has decreased. But what I will say is Deep State is showing us a hell of a lot of grey zone, likely that is red. A Ukrainian officer today saying the grey zone Ukraine shows in Pokrovsk should be red. But a lot of this grey zone is shown around the Velika Novosilka, at least what once was the front line there, now Huliopol and Pokrovskoy. So let's go into the maps. Here's Ukraine in the centre. The red areas occupied since 22, purple since then 2014. We turn this on, the red check, blue check, Russia, Ukrainian advancements in the past 24 hours. This is the area where there's a very, very healthy dose of grey zone, all the way from Ivanivkia all the way down to then the Huliopol front line. You can see the red growing today here. But I want to show you something. This is why going against the tactic that the Russians are using at the moment of holding and the destruction and the superiority and overmatch of those long-range systems such as FABs is just so difficult to go against, just that grind forwards. This gives a good example of this. So where we see the red check today, just outside of Uspanivkia, you can see strikes like this. That was the geolocation. And then this is that very large strike that is hit here. Of course, you can see the shockwave coming off that. And that's how the Russians are advancing or exploiting then pockets that have been made, is through the holding and then the level of just tonnage of munition that can be dropped there. Again, click on my profile. I've done a 10-minute, very short video just on how that is being done. But let's look on this area. Oleksivkia, Novoleksandrivkia, and then Adanalivkia sector here. This map showing movements in this direction. But when we look on the then Suryak map, he's showing more movement in the direction of Novoleksandrivkia and Oleksivkia. So the grey zone, Oleksivka and Novoleksivka, he's saying that's becoming red between these. Now, what we say is typically in a war like this, the movement, the grind that we've seen, you won't get these like single prongs out like this. It's more likely to be advancing in that direction. And then so advancing in that direction and then advancing both in the direction of Danilivka to the east and then down to the south. This is what we have spoken about. If you are advancing in a war like this and you're advancing like this, once you get to your point to the east, what you then want to do so you don't have the other side then vertically enveloping you is push one way and the other. And then this desaturates the weapon systems and increases your then lines of communication to the front line. Also, Ternese, exactly the location we saw this being done, and Ukrainian commanders obviously saw this happening and then were attempting to then squeeze that down as well. Let's look on the Huliopol sector. Here we have one map today. We have Vesely just above this near Nove. So this is just this sector here where we can see that grey zone and that movement there. Now, again, the reason I bring up that grey zone is a lot of this being shown grey. I think the Syriac AMK will be showing under control. Therefore, we'll see vastly different kilometre square updates when they come through. Of course, let's look at Pokrovsk. Again, large amounts of grey zone in this, some amount of red zone. Let's go back and then to today, you can see that grey and red then growing to the north. We'll see some blue check. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's look at this. This I found very, very interesting. And as I said yesterday, nothing happens on the battlefield without it being seen. What we are looking at is through a Russian fiber optic drone that is waiting on a road to then ambush whatever vehicle runs down it. We've seen this tactic being used for a number of months. What we saw was when these GUR UH-60 Blackhawks landed, there was basically FPV drones on these guys straight away, and it was very costly. But you can actually see in this footage just over here, you see one of the Blackhawks, and then you see the second Blackhawk basically come straight over the top right here, very low, trying to stay under manned pads. Now, I've only seen footage of 2 of these choppers. Again, many reports of 6 of them. Again, we've seen 2. As I say, basically everything will come out in time of footage. But this operation in here, it does appear so far that this operation has not produced any tangible results, at massive risk to these rare platforms, but also incredible cost to these operators. Now, the bravery, the courage of these troops should be absolutely commended. They're more courageous and more brave than I. But this operation, unless I don't know all the details around this, but unless there was something really specific in here, I don't see how this ever actually went ahead. Not this late in a war with all the lessons that have been learnt so far. I just don't understand the basic thought process that went into this very small number of operators into this saturated, heavily guarded environment. I don't get it. And we've seen then, of course, the footage come out straight away after it of then what appears to be the very costly results of this. Now, what I will say in Pokrovsk, this operation, all this in general, bloggers, YouTubers, Telegrammers, Twitterers, whatever, everyone is trying, or not everyone, but there's many desperately trying to save the narrative around Pokrovsk and this operation. But on the other side, you've got many too who are trying to then exploit this as well. But as I've said, the information war is going to get worse and worse as we go on, as times grow more desperate. And at times of high tension, then the informational war, it's just a mirror reflecting this as well. The more tense things get, it'll just mirror that then tension too. Remember though, back in 2022, and I spoke to these guys, but they wouldn't do an interview because when they released this talking about bots, they received so much hate from one side in the community that they won't do anything public. But it was basically a mathematics study of a university near where I live, and it's just looking at when bots are active. And what they found was a direct correlation between bots being active when there was to try and then produce narratives at then more tense times of attacks, etc. Absolutely on both sides of this. And again, as to be expected, in times like this, you're going to see a lot of bots pushing things to the top as well as just producing information. Now, what I'll say is with all propaganda, and this goes just throughout, whoever seems to be on the winning side, who has the initiative at the current time, they will exaggerate. They'll tend to exaggerate what is happening. The side without the initiative, or the losing side at the time, will tend to fabricate as well, or play down, but more leaning to as well play down, but also more fabrication than the side who has the initiative at the time. That's just how propaganda seems to work throughout war, and you can apply that in many different areas. Now, we're going to come back to Pokrovsk, but we've got a lot to go over there, so I want to show you earlier some very interesting movements up in Pokrovsk. Now, this area, in Kupyansk, the forgotten envelopment. Now, this not being spoken about much at all, not moving today, but we have seen over the past days, Suryak, AMK, other mappers showing movements. We've also seen many others trying to say Kupyansk is not then at threat. And to me, that says, well, let's have a look. So we see 50% of the city that Suryak is saying is under control and has closed up that pocket in the center and heading down to then further south of Sobolivkia as well. And then today, new update up in the northeastern side that they've crossed the Oskil and moving into these northern districts. So closing in this area right up into here. So of course you can sort of see where Sinkivkia sits, but this sector around here, of course, on the eastern side of the Oskil, keep an eye on that. Now, what we have seen is a lot of increased operations around Vovchansk. Grey zone, red zone moving on this map. Of course, more on some of the other mappers. I found this interesting today from a Ukrainian officer. The Vovchansk direction, the enemy is gradually trying to carry out the same operational tactical actions as the Pokrovskoye direction. Although, basically, as they have done everywhere else, they try to bypass the city on the flanks after unsuccessful prolonged frontal assaults on Vovchansk. Since then, some of the bastards have had minimal but stable advances on the flanks, which at some points may create a threatening situation. So, to move around this, what we have said is Vovchansk has been so flattened to actually gain a foothold in the center and defend it or attack it very, very difficult. And he's saying movement around the flanks. And we have seen maps reflecting what he is saying there. Of course, Pokrovsk. Let's look at Pokrovsk. Come down onto here, onto the maps. Again, being told today that what is shown as grey should be shown as red. Let's have a look at some of the footage in here. Now, we do have in Minograd, just down this area, there's many, many different videos like this, but I thought I'd just show you to get an understanding of, you see in areas like this, the amount of munitions, and these, of course, being fabs dropped in multiple sectors across here. And this just gives us an idea of how that is working to target areas, but you hold with the drones, target with the heavier munitions to break through also. And that is what we are seeing, but all throughout. Let's have a look at some of the maps. So we can see Mr. Suryak maps today on the eastern side that there's been further exploitation, therefore further than squeezing on that southern area that is being currently dislocated, as well as the attacks up on this northwestern side to try and pull back some control in there. So, of course, where we saw those choppers then land. Newer update, again, showing then further ground being made just inside of Pokrovsk. But then as well to the northern side, what does this say in here? I can't read on this map right in here. This must be Rodyanske. In Rodyanske, that Ukraine has had a pushback and controlling some of this, but most of Rodyanske, according to most mappers, is then coming under then Russian control as well. We've seen geolocations to show that well outside of the grey shown on this map. But then also the challenge down in that south, that Sukriya area where Russia's pushing up and Ukraine trying to have a withdrawal out of here. This pocket right down in here is going to be very, very dangerous to get out of. Let's talk about withdrawals before we go over what Deep State says the situation is and what an anonymous Ukrainian officer is saying the situation is also. So let's go over this. Now, this is from Field Manual 3-90 Tactics, the Retrograde. Now, these are very, very long manuals. Again, I'll give you the relevant parts. And this is about withdrawal. Although the commander avoids withdrawing from action under enemy pressure, it is not always possible. He may conduct a withdrawal when the situation requires rapid action to save the command from disaster. This usually occurs after a tactical reverse or after a unit reaches the culminating point. When an aggressive enemy becomes aware of friendly forces' withdrawal or of its intention to withdraw, he attempts to exploit the withdrawal, using all of his capabilities to try and turn the withdrawal into rout. So once you then, if you need to then withdraw, once you see then your opposing side start to withdraw, you do try and exploit onto this. Carve-on Clausewitz all the way to more modern figures speak about this. He may have ground and air superiority and continuously attempt to pursue, encircle, and destroy the withdrawing force. In the 1933 Soviet field manual, and I know so much has changed since then, but deep in that somewhere, They talk about you should take all risk to exploit a retreating force. He will try to use the combination of direct pressure and enveloping forces and fires to isolate the withdrawing friendly force for later destruction. So again, you try and use everything at your disposal to then exploit this. Withdrawals are inherently dangerous because they involve moving units to the rear and away from a usually stronger enemy force. So you're trying to move a weaker force away from an enemy force, but into the rear. The heavier the previous fighting and the closer contact with the enemy, the more difficult the withdrawal. OPSEC, operational security, is extremely important. A unit usually confines its rearward movement to times and conditions where the enemy cannot observe the activity. Of course, with drones in warfare, I believe this is written in 2013, a lot has changed, so that he cannot easily detect the operation. To help preserve secrecy and freedom of action, for example, the commander must consider visibility conditions at times when the enemy reconnaissance satellites can observe friendly movements. Now, this is something that you and I have spoken about, that if there was a day of like bad fog, which we have seen exploited recently by both Ukrainian and Russian forces, notably the Ukrainian forces apparently pulling out across this area from being enveloped in Katerinivka, and the Russian forces actually moving into Sofivkia direction as well, that should be taken at that opportunity. And we said if there was an opportunity like this, should it be taken? Now, this is from 3-90-1, Offense and Defense, Volume 1, Headquarters Department of the US Army, talking about the combination pursuit, but direct pressure, withdraw. Again, you get a bit of idea of this. I'm not saying there's going to be the pursuit which you may expect, but you can get an idea of pursuit with drones, infantry, or artillery as well. It doesn't need to be physical ground movements that you may see typically. Now, you can see this in here. So you've got your enemy force in here, where you can work on the flanks and push through the guts as well. And you'll get an idea as we read this. Just keep this figure in your head. The direct pressure force is a force employed in a pursuit operation that orients on the enemy main body to prevent enemy disengagement or defensive reconstruction prior to the envelopment by an encircling force. It normally conducts a series of attacks to slow the enemy's retirement by forcing the enemy to stand and fight. So force them to stand and fight and don't let them then disengage or reconstitute further back. What you're trying to do is slow the tempo of the enemy's withdrawal or fix the enemy force in its current position. If possible, you then may destroy the enemy's rear security forces. The direct pressure forces actions to help set the conditions necessary for the success of the force conducting the encircling operation by maintaining constant pressure. So by this constant pressure up the guts, you're then building the ability to flank or disengage or withdraw out of here. The encircling force is in pursuit operations. The force maneuvers to the rear flank of the enemy to block the enemy's escape so that the enemy can be destroyed between the direct pressure force and the encircling force. So what you're trying to do is squeeze on like three sides. So that push up the guts and then squeeze down. So then parallel along the enemy's lines of retreat. If the encircling force cannot outdistance the enemy or cut the enemy off, the encircling force may also attack the flank of the retreating enemy. So if you can't cut off, you're attacking on the flanks as there is withdrawal. If the force conducting encircling operation conducts an envelopment or a turning movement to position itself where it can block the enemy's escape, trap the enemy between two forces, which leads to complete annihilation of the enemy. This is where I've said hasty withdrawal operations in the battle sequence can be and have been previously the most costly part of the entire battle sequence on a specific area. The force providing direct pressure conducts hasty attacks to maintain contact and apply unrelenting pressure until it destroys the enemy force. The force applying direct pressure prevents enemy disengagement and subsequent reconstitution of the enemy's defense and inflicts maximum casualties. So you get this idea in here. And this is the thing, by applying pressure into Pokrovsk itself, into then far south Minograd, into Sukrya, you're not allowing a disengagement of forces in this, so you can push either with drones or men, as war has changed a little bit, but into this sector. And by not allowing that then a disengagement, you're squeezing, and of course, what we're looking for in a war like this is further attrition of forces and turning withdrawal into rout and potentially the most costly part of operations. This is a very, very dangerous situation in here. Now, let's have a look at what then Deep State says to get an idea of what basically the Ukrainian ministry is saying. Situation, Pokrovsk enemy infiltration city continues through the Defence Forces defensive lines in the south along the previously mentioned sanctions in this area along the railway from Ketlini. So continuing to push into. The enemy has been detected in various parts of Pokrovsk, which increases the grey zone. And they are concentrating in the eastern outskirts of the city of Rivne. The enemy is beginning to settle in the city and establish positions and observation posts and drone pilot positions. That is something to take into account. Sorry, I'm still very lungy. This facilitation with the presence of a sufficient number of infantry. So again, if you're establishing OPs, drone positions, all this, I don't really know if you could consider that grey zone at this point in time. Senior military leadership had arrived in the Pokrovsk area, taking control of the situation. Now, the videos we see of Sersky, all these, it's not in Pokrovsk. It's well outside of Pokrovsk. Currently, we see decisions to apply various specialised units to clear the enemy from the city. So more being put in, as we saw with their choppers, who has amassed several hundred infantry. However, no decisions yet regarding blocking the enemy's infiltration of the southern part of the city. So this is where basically they're walking in through Zhetozove area into the south. And from what we're about to go over, looks like they have been for some time. So this is from Ukrainian media right here. We'll belt feed through some of this through a drone pilot, or going by Valery, but of course, anonymity name. Pokrovsk and Minograd are already fucked, to put it briefly. He just left his position where he spent basically 2 weeks. The UAV unit was 900 meters from the enemy as the Russians pushed deeper and deeper. Pessimistic forecasts of the future in the key city in southern Donetsk region are expressed not only by military personnel working directly with the city, but also by the officers. Now, what I will say is I will listen to an officer in the city or a military personnel, non-commissions in the city, well beyond all the officers that just work basically with politicians. He says, high-ranking officer in Pokrovsk's direction, everything that is ground deep state in the city of Pokrovsk should be painted red. The Russians control approximately 60% of the city. The enemy is in both Rodyansk and Minograd. The situation is a mess. Pokrovsk was on the verge of complete occupation after hundreds of Russian infantry have then infiltrated, but they've been entering since the summer, basically through the south, and they've been accumulating in Pokrovsk. He says, those who are in the front lines of Pokrovsk are basically surrounded with little chance of escaping. There are houses, neighborhoods, and streets that it's almost impossible to walk through without being shot. Again, not allowing that disengagement to squeeze on the flanks. Again, the doctrine, if you're in a way like this, the command has different opinion, believing that search and rescue operations involving additional units can save the situation in the city. And this is the thing. The senior command, they think they can still save this, as we saw with that chopper operation, of the chopper opera. Now, the Russians control much more of Pokrovsk. For the first time, groups of Russian infantry, they infiltrated in July through Zhetozove, through that south, according to Ukrainian defenders, they found and destroyed. However, it's not been possible to completely secure that southern flank. So although, yes, the DRGs moved in, we've had reports that they had been surrounded, destroyed, etc., but they hadn't been able to stop the flow coming in too. On the contrary, the situation is only worse. The lack of infantry in the brigades, exhausted by long defence of Pokrovsk. Their interlocutors say, those are conservative estimates of those hundreds that have entered, that there could be much more. Again, the numbers, they're definitely different. Taking into account the fact that defence forces are gradually eliminating Russians every day, and the enemy, unfortunately, continues to penetrate the city in a dynamic situation. Accurate calculations only play into the enemy's hands. And this is what we see, is Sersky very recently has spoken about and warned officers very publicly about delivering false information that could help the enemy out of Pokrovsk. And what we have said is this delivering, though, overly rosy points, or telling the real situation publicly and not wanting that to affect then the PR holding this area as well? This is the thing, that there needs to be a super large separation between what are informational operations, which are important, and what are tactical decisions. And when you start getting those influencing each other, you end up with what we saw in Kursk. Again, like we have said, that propaganda must support operations. Operations can't support then the propaganda. But it's easy to fall into that trap. The 7th Rapid Reaction Forces, which lead into defence of Pokrovsk Minograd, prefers not to give an exact number. They note the Russians are not entrenched in areas of Pokrovsk, but are periodically moved. So they're not actually accumulating in here, but again, this is that difference between who's there and then further senior. Then military work in the city, insist the Russians control, park the city. So the ones who are directly in there, they're saying they control it. I know who I'm more going to believe. We're not talking about parity anymore. They control a much larger part of Pokrovsk. They set the pace, impose initiative, and they're on course of hostilities. In the parts of Pokrovsk, they've established themselves and are holding the defence. In others, they're moving as far north as possible, aiming to go as deep as possible into our rear. Again, go back to that Doctrine map I showed you, and it makes sense as the way to do this. Now, you enter the position, drones are constantly flying above you. There are 200 people lying around who have basically not been taken away. The occupiers could bypass then advanced infantry positions and infiltrate the rear, as we have shown. They're calling it the Brownian movement, but of course we have called this the Willies paint by number that we have just seen. The infantry on the front almost never fights. Now my mortarmen and pilots are now often involved in gun battles at the front line. This is a warning we saw come out the other day, was if you're on an artillery post, drone post, don't bloody go to sleep, because you never know, guys can pop up well behind the line. Today, our pilots, they fired. One Russian was wounded, one was killed. But if the pilots can work in such conditions where they have to use small arms, and it's only temporary because you're constantly flying, you can't effectively guard the perimeter. So even behind the line, these DRGs engaging pilots, artillery, mortarmen behind the line. Another interlocutor, a platoon commander, said these drone pilots are afraid to enter positions in Pokrovsk because now it's unclear where the enemy is and where their own are, which I can completely understand given the situation that we have then seen. It's not just DRG here. You enter position, drones are flying constantly above you, and that is a little bit demoralising. Because of this, our second echelon, our second echelon is not working. It provides 90% of the destruction. Accordingly, we can't kill the Russians on the outskirts of the city. If we do not have UAVs, then Russia will outnumber us on terms of infantry personnel. So constantly moving in, not allowing this. Of course, you see the outcomes of this to try and kill further out. Due to the chaos the Russians are spreading in the city, on the one hand, they are creating problems for the rear units. They're ensuring that they can infiltrate the city unnoticed down in that south, but again, not allowing disengagement as well. Now, in addition, UAV pilots, they've pulled too many forces into Pokrovsk that it will be impossible to completely push back a large force from entering the city. But again, what we were told was that looking like 2 choppers with maybe 20 guys all up, but we saw 11 is going to push. That's why I just don't understand that operation. This is already the 4th stage of cancer. The 4th stage of cancer is not treatable. First, there are a lot of them. Second, there is no concept of how to counteract this. We reached too late to the threat, now impossible to correct the situation. 3 weeks ago, we could have tried. But then we pushed UAVs away. We cannot effectively destroy them in the building. And this is what we saw weeks ago when it was like warned about situations being pushed up the chain. But you see like weeks ago saying, hey, look, if we don't do it now, it's going to get worse and worse. And now these guys are saying basically the event horizon, the Rubicon has been crossed. It's too late now to do anything. But of course, can you withdraw out of here without it being extremely costly? Pokrovsk is just an ideal place to accumulate personnel. The Russians understand this. They are now bringing in a large number of military personnel there who are simply moving forward without resistance because they are simply passing through the gap between the positions. However, not all military personnel are pessimistic about the possibility of at least partially stabilising the situation. An interlocutor from the headquarters of another brigade now, leaving the city could be a mistake. So again, someone from headquarters, because the city's buildings at heights provides an advantage for the UAV operators. The military hopes that stormtroopers and other special forces will be able to alleviate the situation in brigades defending the city. But again, my question would be, at what cost of gaining this too? But he is right in what he says here. If we surrender Pokrovsk, a large number of Russians will accumulate there and they will use Pokrovsk as a bridgehead. There will be a large number of UAV crews who will feel comfortable and destroy us at a distance from 30 kilometers from Pokrovsk. Again, getting some of those higher areas as well. And of course, that massive, strategically important logistical hub that it is too. In another unit, 32nd Mech, which holds the eastern flank, where the Russians are trying to cut off the Pokrovsk-Pavlograd highway, they say additional units will not save the city if the Russians completely cut off the flanks. The situation is not saved by some single miracle unit, but the coordinated interaction of all forces. They're already performing extremely important work in the city, conducting sweep as rescue operations. Their experience in urban combat is valuable, but the effectiveness directly depends on how firmly we, the mechanised units, hold the flanks. So again, it's a holistic view. You're not just going to have one unit. Again, in my experience, many people overestimate the special forces deploying in somewhere like this. Again, this is a multiplier to existing units on the ground. You're not going to just deploy 20 guys into here and have a miraculous saviour of these areas, not in a war like this. According to him, the situation in Pokrovsk and Rodyansk worsens and the roads to Mitrograd are completely or will be completely blocked. If Mitrograd is completely surrounded. You won't be able to build all logistics using large bombers alone because you need mines for mortars. If 60 mines can be delivered by large bombers, 120 the mortar, they can't be delivered. So if we get cut off, but bringing things in by drone, you're not going to get enough of it and be able to lift some of the equipment. If limited logistics, there in Tokyo that is warned, the worst could happen. Cut off logistical routes would mean the defenders have no chance of getting out of the city. This is what we're spoken about. Although we call it Pokrovsk, the stories about this, the story will become about Minograd and Krasny Yar area. They say 1,000 to 1,500 people could still be surrounded. Although some of the military interlocutors still believe the situation in the city can be stabilised, a majority make pessimistic predictions. The president's words of our forces are controlling the situation in Pokrovsk are questioned, and I'd be questioning this too. Now, it's something I haven't gone over in this, but there's a lot of writing on this from many military theorists to doctrines as well, is about orderly withdrawal, maintains then your vision of your command, how you see them. But if you have like a hasty withdrawal like this, it really does have a psychological impact. Maybe we can talk about that tomorrow, if I remember. So far, it's only getting worse. This is just another fortress. We don't have enough fortresses in the war, and now they're adding one or two more. When asked what needs to be conveyed to the command, one of the high-ranking officers answered, "The fact is, there's a great threat of encirclement. If regrouping is not carried out, some people would die. Some will be captured. If no one gives an order to regroup, from 1,000 to 1,500 could be surrounded." Now, this plays into the psychological impact of this, but also down to where there is a very difference between senior command and actual command on the ground in the reporting. But we had seen some warnings of that reporting, which we then picked up on as well. Did I delete my Pokrovsk North? Maybe didn't have one. Let me do this. Oh, sorry, yes. So we see Pokrovsk North, some blue area coming into here. We have seen Ukraine having some success on this front. Although today, Syriac maps, he's saying the Russian army launched a counterattack and managed to recapture some positions of Kushivya west of Shakovka. So some directions in this area here. Keep an eye out for this. Now, let's have a look on the maps. Let's have a look at some other areas. Then let's come Konstantinivka area down and around here. We see a lot of grey zone, but we see today that out in Podachne, that Russians are making some further ground on the prong, heading down these two roads from Alexandros to Topachke and filling in around this sector. Of course, increasing that then vice grip that could become a very deep envelopment of Konstantinivka, especially the exploitation following Pokrovsk. Let's move up. Seversk, we have Zadashne, Toshke, Liman, Terny, front line. This whole area that has been then made, basically this front, in my opinion, leads all the way from Seversk South, to then this Borova area up in here, this double envelopment. It's sort of not double envelopment, but you get these, the northern and the southern one pushed by this then prong in between, which is expanding its ground. Now, we have this one here. We look for Yarova, Novoselivskia on the first update in this sector. And on this front, Alexandrovivka, that the Russians are then further expanding. And you can see this is a large amount of ground right out on this area, right through these sector in here. Now, we have a second update in this area today right in here, and we see this is down to the base of where the Liman front is, just down into this in Yampil direction. So Yampil just in here, shown in grey zone. What I will say is the confirmation of Ukrainian forces being in here is confirmed by one grey zone on this map, but there is footage of Russian FPV drones striking soldiers in here to confirm that there is definitely presence in said area. And then we have this envelopment into here. So we can see this is the area I've been speaking about of pushing north and south. I showed you earlier on in this video. Right up into this sector, long logistics up into here. We have Borosivka and Rivkia in here, and we see that Ukraine had a push back into here after clashes. So let's see, it's not reflected on this map, but movement in there. Legends. The thunder basically stayed away a little bit for us. I hope you're having a fantastic day. We'll continue to keep up with all the changes day by day. Have a great day. Look after yourselves. Have a great start to your week. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.